Today, something happened that didn't explode across headlines in the way you would expect for an event of this magnitude. There were no dramatic visuals replayed on loop, no immediate sense of shock in mainstream coverage, and yet beneath that quiet surface, a shift may have taken place that is far more consequential than most people realize. Because what occurred was not just the loss of a high-value asset, it was the exposure of a vulnerability that had gone unchallenged for years. And once something like that is revealed, it doesn't simply disappear. It lingers, it reshapes decisions, and it forces an entire system to operate under a new set of assumptions. The moment itself did not look extraordinary at first. It looked routine, almost predictable. A surveillance aircraft following a pattern it had repeated many times before, maintaining a steady altitude, moving along a familiar route, continuously feeding data into a network designed to interpret and distribute that information instantly. And for the people monitoring it, there was no indication that anything was about to change because everything was behaving exactly as expected. Every signal stable, every update consistent, every detail reinforcing the idea that this was just another standard operation unfolding exactly as planned. And then, without warning, that certainty disappeared. Not slowly, not with warning signs, not with the kind of degradation that usually signals a technical problem, but completely and immediately in a way that did not align with any known failure pattern, because systems rarely fail by vanishing. They fail by struggling, by producing errors, by creating inconsistencies that can be tracked and analyzed. But this was different. This was an absence so complete that it forced the people watching it to question their own understanding of what they were seeing. Because when something simply stops existing on a system that is designed to see everything, the first instinct is not to assume an attack. It is to assume that the system itself is wrong. For a brief window, that assumption held because it had to, because accepting the alternative would mean accepting that something had occurred which should not have been possible under the existing understanding of the environment. And during that time, checks were run, connections were verified, systems were questioned, but none of those efforts produced an answer. Because the issue was not within the system, the issue was that the object being tracked was no longer there to be seen. That is where the visible event ends, but that is not where the real story begins. Because focusing only on that moment, on the disappearance itself, misses the far more important question, which is not what happened in that instant, but what that instant revealed. Because events like this do not matter solely for their immediate impact, they matter for the assumptions they break. And in this case, one of the most important assumptions in modern air operations may have just been challenged in a way that cannot be easily reversed. To understand why, you have to look beyond the idea of an aircraft as just a piece of hardware and instead see it as part of a larger system. Because this was not simply a platform moving through the sky, it was a central node in a network that depends on constant, wide-area awareness to function effectively, a system designed not to engage directly, but to enable everything else to operate with precision, coordination, and confidence. And without that system, the network does not stop working, but it stops working in the same way. What this aircraft provided was not just data, it was context, a continuous real-time understanding of everything happening within a vast area, allowing different elements of the system to act as if they were part of a single coordinated entity rather than separate units operating independently. And that distinction is critical, because in modern operations, the advantage does not come from having more assets. It comes from using those assets more effectively through shared awareness. Remove that shared awareness, and the entire structure begins to change. Decisions take longer, responses become less precise, coordination becomes more difficult, and even if each individual component remains functional, the system as a whole becomes less efficient, less predictable, and ultimately less capable of maintaining the same level of control over the environment. For years, this capability has been treated as reliable, almost guaranteed, something that could be counted on without question. Because it operated in a space that was considered relatively safe, at altitudes and distances that placed it outside of immediate danger, and because that safety was never meaningfully challenged, it gradually became embedded into planning as a constant rather than a variable. That is where the real risk began to form, because when something is treated as a constant, its potential vulnerability is no longer actively considered, and when that happens, the entire structure built around it becomes dependent on an assumption that has not been fully tested. Now consider what it means when that assumption is suddenly challenged. Because the explanation that has been presented publicly focuses on the mechanism, on the idea that a capable interception system engaged a high-value target. And while that may describe what happened at a surface level, it does not fully address the implications of where and how it happened, because the location of the aircraft is not a minor detail, it is central to understanding the scale of the shift. The aircraft was not operating in an area that would traditionally be considered high risk. It was positioned in a space that had been treated as a buffer, a zone where distance itself was expected to provide a degree of protection, And that expectation was based on known limitations of opposing systems, limitations that defined how far a threat could realistically reach. But when an event occurs that contradicts those limitations, it forces a reevaluation. Because if a system is able to reach beyond its expected range, or if it has been positioned closer than previously understood, then the entire concept of safe distance begins to collapse, and once that concept is weakened, everything that depends on it must be reconsidered. There are only a few ways this could have happened, and each of them leads to the same conclusion. Either the capability has been extended in a way that was not fully accounted for, or the deployment of that capability has shifted geographically in a way that changes the operational landscape, and in both cases the outcome is identical. The boundaries have moved, and when boundaries move, planning must follow. This is why the event itself is only the starting point. Because the real impact is not contained within the moment it occurred, it extends forward into every decision that comes after it, into every mission that must now account for a risk that was previously considered unlikely, into every calculation that must now include variables that did not exist before. And this is where the deeper significance begins to emerge, because the most important outcome is not the physical loss. It is the introduction of doubt into a system that relied on certainty. And doubt, once introduced, does not remain isolated. It spreads, it influences, it reshapes behavior in ways that are often subtle but deeply consequential. Operations that once felt straightforward now require additional consideration. Routes that once felt safe now require reassessment. Timelines that once felt reliable now require flexibility. And all of these changes occur not because of repeated action, but because of a single demonstration that something previously assumed to be secure may no longer be as secure as it once seemed. That is the shift that matters, because once a vulnerability is proven, it does not need to be proven again to have an effect. The knowledge alone is enough, and that knowledge is what transforms this from a single event into something much larger, something that continues to influence decisions long after the moment itself has passed. Something that forces an entire system to operate under a new reality where certainty has been replaced with calculation. And once that transition happens, there is no simple way to return to the previous state, because certainty, once broken, does not rebuild easily. It has to be earned again through adaptation, through demonstration, through time. And until that happens, every action taken within that system carries the weight of what was revealed in that single moment. That is where this story truly begins. Now, this is where the story shifts from what happened into why it matters on a level that is far more difficult to ignore. Because once you move past the event itself and begin to examine the structure behind it, you start to see something that is not about a single loss, but about a change in the balance between cost and impact. And that change is what gives this moment its real weight. Because in modern strategy, the most powerful moves are not always the most expensive ones. They are the ones that force the other side to spend more, adjust more, and operate under tighter constraints than before. When you look at the estimated cost involved in executing an intercept like this compared to the value of the system that was lost, the difference is not just noticeable, it is extreme. And that kind of imbalance creates a very specific type of pressure, because it means that the action itself does not need to be repeated frequently to remain effective. It only needs to be demonstrated once to create a lasting effect. And that is exactly what makes this situation so complex to respond to, because the usual approach of deterrence through retaliation becomes less straightforward when the cost of the original action is relatively low. But the deeper issue is not just the imbalance, it is what that imbalance enables, because once a vulnerability is exposed at such a low cost, the responsibility of managing that vulnerability shifts almost entirely onto the side that was affected, and managing it is not simple, because there are only a limited number of ways to respond, and each of them introduces its own set of limitations. Continuing operations without change carries an obvious risk, because it assumes that the conditions which allowed the initial event to occur are no longer present, and that is an assumption that cannot be verified with certainty, while changing operational patterns introduces a different kind of problem, because every adjustment made to reduce exposure also reduces effectiveness in some way, and over time, those reductions begin to accumulate. Increasing distance from potential threat areas may improve safety, but it also reduces the range and clarity of what can be observed. Altering altitude changes how detection systems interact with the environment, sometimes improving certain aspects while weakening others. Adding additional protection requires reallocating resources that may be needed elsewhere. Varying schedules introduces unpredictability, but it also creates inconsistency. And inconsistency leads to gaps. Those gaps are where the situation becomes more than just a question of reduced capability, because gaps are not random in systems that operate on structured cycles. They follow patterns, and patterns can be studied. And once they are studied, they can be anticipated, and once they are anticipated, they can be used. This is where the maintenance factor becomes critical, and it is often overlooked because it does not appear dramatic, it does not produce immediate visible effects, but it plays a defining role in how sustainable any operation actually is. Because systems like this are not continuously available, they require regular maintenance, calibration, and inspection, and that process takes time, often significantly more time than the missions themselves. When multiple units are available, this cycle can be balanced, one operating, one being maintained, one prepared for deployment, creating a rotation that ensures continuity. But when the number of available units decreases, that balance becomes fragile, because eventually, the timing of maintenance requirements overlaps. And when that happens, availability drops, not by choice, but by necessity. During those periods, coverage is reduced or temporarily absent, and those periods are not invisible. They can be observed through patterns of activity, through changes in behavior, through the absence of expected signals, and once those patterns are identified, they provide something extremely valuable to any opposing side. They provide timing. And timing, in any strategic environment, is one of the most powerful advantages that can be gained without additional effort, because actions taken during moments of reduced visibility or delayed response carry a lower level of risk. And when those moments can be predicted with reasonable accuracy, they can be integrated into planning in a way that maximizes their effectiveness. This is what transforms the situation from a single event into a recurring condition. A condition that does not require constant reinforcement. A condition that sustains itself through the natural limitations of the system it affects. Now consider the timeline required to restore full capability, because replacing a system like this is not immediate. It involves multiple stages: production, integration, testing, training, each of which takes time, and that time is not measured in weeks or even months. It is measured in years, and during that entire period, the reduced capacity remains a factor that must be accounted for in every operation. That means the adjustments being made now are not temporary responses to a short-term problem. They are the beginning of a longer phase of adaptation, a phase in which decisions are made under constraints that did not previously exist, a phase in which every action carries an additional layer of consideration, and that is where the psychological impact becomes just as significant as the physical one. Because systems do not operate independently of the people who plan and manage them, and those people rely on confidence, not just in the equipment, but in the assumptions that guide their decisions, and when those assumptions are challenged, even once, that confidence begins to shift. Risk assessments become more cautious, margins for error become smaller, opportunities that would have been considered acceptable are reevaluated, and all of this happens without any further action required. That is the real efficiency of what occurred, because the most significant outcome is not the immediate loss. It is the change in behavior that follows, the adjustments that continue, the constraints that persist, the environment that evolves as a result. This is why the event cannot be understood in isolation, because its impact is not confined to the moment in which it occurred. It extends forward, influencing decisions, shaping strategies, altering expectations, and redefining what is considered possible within that operational space. And once those definitions change, they do not revert easily. They become the new reference point, the new baseline, the new reality that everything else must adapt to. So when looking at this situation, it is important to move beyond the visible details, beyond the immediate loss, and focus on the underlying shift that it represents. Because that shift is what will determine how similar scenarios unfold in the future. Because in the end, what was affected was not just a single system, it was the structure that depended on it. And once that structure changes, even slightly, everything connected to it must change as well. And that process is not sudden, it is gradual. It unfolds over time, through decisions, through adjustments, through the quiet, continuous process of adaptation. And that is where the real story continues long after the moment itself has passed.